theorizing about population, that is population size and change, have remained an important subject since time immemorial. Many of the ancient philosophers like Confucius from China, Kautilya from India, Ibn Khaldun from Arab and Plato from Greece, and modern thinkers like Adam Smith, David Rickard and others earlier directly or indirectly have said somewhat significant on population issues. For instance, Kautilya, a contemporary of Plato, had written in his Arthashastra that a large population is a source of political, economic and military strength of a nation. Similarly, the 14th century Arab historian Ibn Khaldun maintained in his theory of rise and fall that the growth of dense population is generally favorable to the maintenance and increase of imperial power. To the Jews, the injunction to Adam and Eve by the Almighty to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth has been a guiding principle for their attitude towards marriage and procreation. The Chinese philosopher Confucius argued that a numerical balance be maintained between population and environment. Thus, he was not in favor of unchecked growth of population. He was the first who gave the concept of optimum population level. In ancient Greece, the earliest thinkers favored the expansion of population, but Plato was a restrictionist who advocated as absolute limit of population. After completion of this chapter, you would be able to understand the Malthus' controversial theory on population growth in terms of the concept of moral restraint. Second one, break down the demographic transition model or theory into 5 recognizable stages based on how countries reach industrialization. One of the earliest demographers, Edmund Halley, was the first scientist to use death statistics in different age groups to determine a person's likelihood of death as he or she passed through each age group. But as a science, it emerged only in the last 250 years. The systematic compilation of data was first begun on a large scale in the 19th century in Europe. 1766 to 1834, that was his period time, was the key figure to analyze the population statistics. His formulation on population was a landmark in the history of population theories. He generalized the relationship between population factors and social change. 1798, Malthus argued that because of the strong attraction of two sexes, the population could increase by multiplies, doubling every 25 years. He contended that the population would eventually grow so large that food production would be insufficient. Human capacity for reproduction exceeded the rate at which subsistence from the land can be increased. Malthus further wrote, population when unchecked increases in a geometrical ratio. Subsistence increases only in an arithmetical ratio. Malthus contended that the world's population was growing more rapidly than the available food supply. He argued that the food supplies increases in the arithmetic progression, that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on, whereas the population expands by a geometric progression, that is 1, 2, 4, 8, 16 and so on. According to him, the population would increase by multiples, doubling every 25 years. He said the gap between the food supply and population will continue to grow over time. Even though food supply will increase, it would be insufficient to meet the needs of expanding population. Moreover, the famine and the natural calamities cause widespread sufferings and increase the death rate, which is nature's check against population. In brief, Malthus theory states that population is necessarily limited by means of subsistence. Population invariably increases where means of subsistence increased unless prevented by some very powerful and obvious checks. These checks and the checks which repress the superior power of population and keep its effects on a level with the means of subsistence are all resolvable into moral restraint, vice and misery. Malthus based his above arguments on man's two basic characteristics essential to the maintenance of life, that is, one, the need for food, and second, the passion between sexes. It was the second which led people to marry at a relatively early age and would result in such a large number of births that the population would double itself in few years if unchecked by misery and vice. Malthus referred to two classes of checks which kept population down. One, positive means. He spoke of famine, that is hunger, disease, war, pestilence and vicious customs about women. Two, negative means. He explicitly demanded artificial means of birth control and suggested as an alternative that birth rate be decreased through preventive measures such as late marriage, that is postponing marriage until later age, moral restraint and chastity. He contended that without such restraints the world would face widespread hunger, poverty and misery. The positive and preventive checks which occur in human population to prevent excessive growth relate to practices affecting mortality and fertility respectively. Malthus saw the tension between population and resources as a major cause of the misery of much of the humanity. He was not, however, in favor of contraceptive methods since their use did not generate the same drive to work hard as would a postponement of marriage. Malthus argued that the positive and preventive checks are inversely related to each other. In other words, where positive checks are very effective, the preventive checks are relatively less effective and vice versa. However, in all societies, some of these checks are in constant operation throughout a varying magnitude of effectiveness. Malthus believed that despite these checks, the inability of increased food supply to keep abreast of population increase always results in some kind of a situation of overpopulation. Malthus' views have been widely challenged on many grounds. The main criticism about his theory are the validity of his two sets of ratios has been questioned by his critics. It is argued that population has rarely grown in geometrical proportion and means of production have rarely multiplied in arithmetic progression. Malthus overemphasized the positive checks and did not visualize the role of preventive checks like contraceptives and family planning. Neo-Malthusists argued that the adoption of birth control within marriage, human inventions in the fields of birth control, health and nutrition and agriculture have helped to a great extent to strike a balance between human production and supply. Malthus was also severely criticized for ignoring the role of changing technology and the consequent transformation in socio-economic setup of a society. He did not fully appreciate the extent to which improved agricultural technology and crop fertilization could sustain large population. Neo-Malthusians agree that there are absolute limits on food supply, energy and other resources. Furthermore, they suggest that the problem is intensified by the disproportionate consumption of such resources by so-called developed, that is industrialized actions. This formulation has been challenged by other researchers, yet none would deny that starvation is a very real fact even in 2020. According to International Food Research Policy Institute, out of 79 countries, 65 come under the category of alarming level of hunger, that is Burundi, Ethiopia, Chad, Eritrea and Timor have been categorized as the 5 hungriest countries in the world. Around the world, we read many reports of starvation, death and malnutrition. With such images in mind, a representative of the World Bank stated in 1981 that the ghost of Malthus is not buried yet, which means what he said is true. Ironically, gains in food supplies do not always lead to progress in the fight against starvation. It puts pressure on food prices that makes it more difficult for the poor to buy the food they need. Both the positive checks of hunger and disease referred to by Malthus do not operate today, except the terrible disaster sometimes caused by tsunamis and the hurricanes like Katrina, Rita and floods or rains in the desert regions like Barmer and Jaisalmer in recent times. But catastrophe of this nature in any part of the world is immediately rushed to the affected place from surplus areas all over the world. A marked decline in the death rate even in the developing countries is a significant factor in the context of population spurt. Moreover, natural calamities referred to above have occurred in underpopulated areas also, and thus there was no causal relationship between positive checks and overpopulation. Malthus also failed to realize even the biological limitations that a population cannot grow beyond a certain limits. Demographic transition is a term first used by Warren S. Thompson in 1929 and later on by Frank W. Notestian in 1945, referring to a historical process of change which accounts the trends in births, deaths and population growth that occurred in today's industrialized societies, especially European societies. This process of demographic change began for the most part of the later 18th century. Demographic transition should not be regarded as a law of population growth, but as a generalized description of the evolutionary process. In simple terms, it is a theory which attempts to specify general laws by which human population change in size and structure during industrialization. It is frequently accepted as a useful tool in describing the demographic history of a country. The theory postulates a particular pattern of demographic change from a high fertility and high mortality to a low fertility and low mortality when a society progresses from a large rural agrarian and illiterate society to a dominant urban, industrial, literate and modern society. One, that the decline in immortality comes before the decline in fertility. Second, that the fertility eventually declines to match mortality, and third one, that socio-economic transformation of a society takes place simultaneously with its demographic transformation. The demographic transition theory is characterized by conspicuous transition stages. The transition from high birth and high death rates to low rates can be divided into 3 stages, and some scholars like Haggett in 1975 have divided into 4 or 5 stages. So, coming to the stages, the first, that is stage 1, here we find high and fluctuating birth and death rates with little population growth. Stage 2, we find high birth rates and declining death rates with a rapid population growth, and stage 3, low birth rate and death rates with slow population growth. Stage 4, declining birth rates and low death rates and declining rate of population growth, and stage 5, birth and death rates approximately equal, which in time will result in zero population growth. So, in the first stage of transition, death rates, especially the infant deaths, begin to fall as a result of advances in public health and sanitation, as well as improvements in nutrition and food supply. Since the birth rate continues to remain high relative to the declining death rate, there is a rapid transitional growth as we find in India today. In the second stage, changes in social attitudes, the introduction of cheap forms of contraception and increases in life expectancy create social pressures for smaller families and for a reduction of fertility. The diffusion of knowledge and cheap medical technology has brought many non-industrial societies into this stage of demographic transition. However, these societies have been unable to enter the third stage. The result has been very high rates of population growth in countries that are not experiencing corresponding economic growth. In the last, that is third stage of demographic transition, birth and death rates decline appreciably, which eventually becomes approximately equal, and in time it will result in zero population growth. Before this stage begins, there can be one more stage in which low birth and death rates led to slow population growth. The populations of advanced urban industrial societies which have entered the last stage are now stable with birth and death rates. In some cases, for example, Eastern and Central Europe, birth rates have fallen so slow that the rate of natural increase was actually zero or negative. In this stage, the technical know-how is abundant, the deliberate controls on family planning are common, and the literacy and education levels are also very high. The growth pattern of human population is thus held to be S-shaped, involving a transition from one type of demographic stability with high death rates to another type of plateau with low death and birth rates. Among the later demographers, Coyle and Hoover further elaborated upon the role of development and modernization in the process of transition in demographic behavior, maintained that a society characterized by peasant economy is marked with very high birth and death rates. Death rates are high because of lack of adequate nutritive food, primitive sanitary conditions, and absence of any preventive and curative measures of control over diseases. A high birth rate, on the other hand, is a functional response to high death rates, particularly among infants and children. In the present day world, as would be true of any point in time, different countries of the world are at different stages on demographic transition. In the opinion of 𝗓𝗏 in 1969, this is largely due to the dual nature of man. According to him, biologically man is same everywhere and is engaged in the process of reproduction, but culturally man differs from one part of the world to another. It is the cultural diversity of man that gives rise to varying fertility patterns in different areas, resulting in different stages of demographic transition. Although the theory of demographic transition has been appreciated widely by the demographers, it has been criticized on many grounds also. There are even critics who have gone to the extent of saying that it cannot be called a theory. So, now let us look what are the main points of criticism here. Firstly, this theory is merely based upon the empirical observations or the experiences of Europe, America and Australia. Secondly, it is neither predictive nor its stages are segmental and inevitable. Thirdly, the role of man's technical innovation cannot be underrated particularly in the field of medicine, which can arrest the rate of mortality. Fourthly, neither does it provide a fundamental explanation of the process of fertility decline, nor does it identify the crucial variables involved in it. Fifth one, it does not provide a time frame for a country to move from one stage to another. So, finally, it does not hold good for the developing countries of the world, which have recently experienced unprecedented growth in population due to drastic decline in death rates. In spite of these criticisms and shortcomings, the demographic transition theory does provide an effective portrayal of world's demographic history at a macro level of generalizations. As an empirical generalization developed on the basis of observing the demographic trend in the West, the transition process for any country can easily be understood. The theory of demographic transition is the most acceptable theory of population growth. It does not lay emphasis on food supply like the Malthusian theory, nor does it develop a pessimistic outlook towards population growth. It is also superior to the optimum theory, which lays an exclusive emphasis on the increase in per capita income for the growth of population and neglects other factors which influence it. The biological theories are also one-sided because they study the problem of population growth simply from the biological angle. Thus, the demographic transition theory is superior to all the theories of population because it is based on the actual population growth trends of the developed countries of Europe. Almost all the European countries have passed through the first three stages of his theory and are now in the fourth stage. Despite its usefulness as a theory describing demographic transition in Western countries, it has been criticized on these grounds. 1. Sequences of stages not uniform. Critics point out that the sequences of the demographic stages have not been uniform. For instance, in some East and Southern European countries and in Spain in particular, the fertility rates declined even when mortality rates were very high. But in America, the growth rate of population was higher than in the second and third stage of demographic transition. Second one, birth rate not declined initially in urban areas. Notestian's assertion that the birth rate declined initially among urban population in Europe has not been supported by empirical evidence. Countries like Sweden and France, which predominantly rural population, experienced decline in birth rates to the same extent as countries like Great Britain with predominantly urban population. Third one, explanations of birth rate decline vary. The theory fails to give the fundamental explanation of decline in birth rates in Western countries. In fact, the causes of decline in birth rate are so diverse that they differ from country to country. Many countries such as China, Brazil, Thailand have passed through the demographic transition model, which we call it as DTM, very quickly due to fast social and economic change. Some countries, particularly African countries, appear to be stalled in the second stage due to stagnant development and the effect of AIDS. Thus, the theory of demographic transition is a generalization and not a theory. Not only this, the theory is equally applicable to the developing countries of the world. Very backwardness countries in some of the African states are still in the first stage, whereas other developing countries are either in the second or in the third stage. India has entered the third stage, where the death rate is declining faster than the birth rate due to better medical facilities and family welfare measures of the government. but the birth rate is declining very slowly, with the result that the country is experiencing population explosion.